Okay, let's talk about Philip K. Dick's novel, 1959 novel, Time Out of Joint. You see here I have the audiobook version. I have this because I ordered the wrong one on an online bookseller in Taiwan, or they screwed up, I'm not sure. I didn't intend to buy the audiobook version, but I have it. In fact, I got a couple others accidentally in the same order, so I guess I screwed that up. It's not a bad recording, but I had to track down a PDF because I really can't go along with just these audiobook versions. But anyways, this is a really good novel, and whether you read it in audiobook version or get the paper copy, I do recommend it. It's one of Dick's greatest novels. It's, I think, his best novel from the 1950s. I pretty much like all of his novels for various reasons, but really reading them thematically, I think, is always rich. But this is a really well plotted novel, and it establishes a mystery, and it comes together really well. And some of his other novels, he kind of gives away a lot in kind of one realization, or the mysteries aren't kind of packaged as being the whole bulk of the novel. Here, it's really about one mystery, one thing that's happening to one character, and we don't get the full answers for that until the very, very end. So everything comes back to the realization in the final few chapters. So in this sense, the novel is really well put together, and I think it's well plotted. So the novel is about a man named Raggle Gum. He's got this really strange name, but maybe that's a clue, actually. And we learn right away that there's things in his world that are off. It's a very conventional, very predictable world. It's basically set in 1959, maybe 1958. It's set basically at the time the book was written. You think, anyways. It's all a false construct. In fact, there are going to be a lot of spoilers in this. It's hard to talk about this book without getting to any spoilers. I don't really feel bad about spoiling a book that was written over 50 years ago, but if you're bothered by that sort of thing, don't watch this. Or if you haven't read this novel yet, maybe you want to go back and read it and come back to hear my thoughts on it. But anyways, the character it's living in a town. Just let's call it like our old town, I think is what it's actually called. But it's basically a Levitt town. It's a very classic 1950s suburban community. And our main character, Raggle Gum, lives with his brother-in-law, and his sister helps pay the rent, but he makes his living doing newspaper contests. And his newspaper contest that he does is called Where Will the Little Green Man Be Next? And the job is you're given just a big graph with thousands of these little squares, and your job is to predict the time and predict the place where the little green man will show up next. And if you guess, you win. And if you guessed a couple times in a row, you win prize money. Now, he's guessed right for years and years, or maybe not years, but for a long time. He's guessed right. So he's been the persistent winner. And he figures this out he figures out there's a pattern to it. And so he studies the pattern. He studies the past entries, and he collects all the data. And it actually takes him like 8 to 10 hours each day to do this. So it's like a full-time job. And he gets a regular income from the newspaper for winning this contest. Now, he lives with his brother-in-law and his sister, and they have a son named Sammy. The neighbors are the blacks, and one is Junie Black, who is presented as a bit of a bimbo, very good-looking, very attractive, very young, but also not very bright. And Raggle Gum develops an attraction to her early in the story. The neighbor, or Junie's husband, Bill Black, works in the water department, and he's I guess the way to describe him is he's a classic 1950s patriarch who's trying too hard and is seeming to put on airs. Like he wears these suits, but he doesn't wear them quite right. He's like overdresses, and he embraces fads. Now, he embraces fads a little bit too aggressively and things. Like one thing is he doesn't want to watch TV, so he over argues against watching TV. It's not just that he doesn't watch much. He says, no, you can't watch TV. So there's he kind of embraces these fads. And Raggle Gum really doesn't like Bill Black. Bill Black's kind of the neighbor that because he's a neighbor, he's stuck to you, but he kind of annoys you. Now, there's a lot in this world that's wrong, though. And if you read carefully, you realize this right away. And a couple examples are there's no radios. For instance, or radios, there's the technology for radios, but radios are basically not used. Everyone has TVs. Now, of course, in the 1950s, people had TVs in their homes, or at least increasingly, had TVs in their homes, but they had radios as well. They kept the radios. But in this world, there's no radios, and there's a good reason for that. Another thing wrong in this world is, for instance, they have a Book of the Month club, and that's a pretty classic thing. Those were popular in those days. But it presents like Uncle Tom's Cabin as a new book. And in fact, Uncle Tom's Cabin was written in the 1850s, early 1850s, I want to say. But it's presented as historical fiction, and it's presented as a new publication. And what's happening is that the people who are creating this world, and it is a completely artificial construct, are filling in the details with just whatever back data they have, right? And sometimes they forget things. So a good example of what they forget is Marilyn Monroe. So at one point, the characters find some old magazines, and they talk about Marilyn Monroe, and they talk about her as this famous celebrity that everyone knows and all the great movies she's been in, yet no one in the family has heard of this woman, Marilyn Monroe. So they're really baffled, like, who is this person? What's going on here? So there's things wrong, and if you read carefully, you notice that from very early in the story. Now, as time goes on, weird things start to happen to Regal Gum, and one of the big things is he starts to be able to see through the simulation he's in. And so at times, like, he'll see, like the famous example of this in the story is he sees a soda counter, and he tries to buy, he drops the money on the counter, and it just falls to the ground, and then the soda counter falls away, and it's left with just a slip of paper that says soda counter. And this has happened to him a lot. And it's something other characters can do as well if they try. And so Vic, his brother-in-law, at one point tries to see through the simulation, and is actually able to do that. And sees that there are real people in this world, actors, I suppose, but there's also people who are just essentially scarecrows and fill-ins for whatever the simulation puts on top of it. Now, the whole technology behind this is not really explored, but it seems he's in a partial simulation, but it's also partially filled in by actors. And it's also partially filled in by the fact that Regal Gum has a psychological drive to escape the world he lives in, his real world, and he retreats to the comfort of his youth. And that's why this world is picked. Now, the real world these characters are in is a war-devastated 1998. Now, as Regal Gum is realizing that the world he lives in is fake, he also begins to realize that he's the center of the world. That he's the center of whatever universe has been created here. Everything is towards him. And in fact, when they build a radio, and actually Sammy builds the radio, and so it's the only radio in town, he's able to listen, and he actually hears people talking about him. And so Regal Gum realizes he's the center of this universe, and he doesn't know why. And he thinks it's connected to the contest. He tries to get away, and he nearly gets away, but he's dragged back, and then he forgets a lot about his experience of trying to escape. He tries to escape a second time successfully with Vic's help. They hijack a truck that brings in supplies, and they just are able to drive it out and get away, and then they can experience the world as it is. And then that gets us to the climax of the story when everything is explained. Now, it turns out that Regal Gum is very important, because that newspaper contest he does, the little marking the little where the little green man will be next, is actually him predicting where missiles are going to drop in this war that Earth is engaged in. And it's actually against the moon, the people of the moon. And I'll get to why that war is important in a little bit. Now, why is Regal Gum able to do this? Well, it's either, maybe he's got a bit of precognition, although that's not a real theme in this book, so I'm not sure that is. It seems that he figured out the patterns, and he was able to use big data to analyze the patterns. But it's fun to play with the idea that maybe he's a bit of a precog, and that's why he was able to predict this. But he was, I think before the war, he was actually like a fashion designer, and he owned a factory making clothes, and later on it made aluminum for the war. And eventually he figured out that he knew how to predict where these bombs, these nuclear bombs from Earth or from the moon would drop on Earth. And then this was able to stop them. Now, something happens to him. First, he starts to have a nervous breakdown over this work, and this is what drives him to want to retreat back to this 1950s environment. The other thing that happens to him is he basically gets recruited by the people on the moon, the lunatics, they're called. And he buys into their argument. And when this happens, the powers on Earth decide they need Regal Gum's ability, because no one else can predict where these missiles will drop. So then they said, well, he'll be comfortable in the 1950s. That's where he psychologically retreats to, the time of his youth. So they create this idealized 1950s environment, fill it with people. And in fact, some of these people, like Margot, his sister, is actually Bill Black's wife in real life, but she's put in here as Regal Gum's sister. But anyway, so they fill it in with programming. They also fill it in with some real people and create this world. So and then they create this newspaper contest for him to continue to do his work, but think he's just living a kind of a relaxed life in the suburbs. And then it's not till the end when Ragglegum finally escapes this world and sees the world as it is, and it's very horrible. It's a military occupied society because it's at war. A lot of the factory production has been driven underground because of the bombs. Not all the bombs get caught, so Ragglegum, who thinks he's winning every day, is actually losing a lot of the time. So in fact, missiles are getting through. Those days he phoned it in, I suppose, led to people dying. It's a kind of a tragic thought. And then the youth on the surface are kind of divided up into these tribal communities. They smoke, they take drugs, and they play music, and they've kind of reformed themselves into tribes, and they speak this weird pidgin that they're not educated. So kind of social conditions on the surface are breaking down. But it's not till we get to that point that we get to the real theme of this story. We think it's all about shifting realities, and to a degree it is. It does match very nicely with Dick's other novels about shifting realities, such as Cosmic Puppets and Eye in the Sky, and then later The Man in the High Castle. But this one is also a story of the frontier and about where humanity's future will be, and about the necessity to look to the future and to have this kind of more Promethean projection into the future. So much of the novel is about Ragglegum coming back to the 1950s, right? Even times when he tries to escape, he's sent back. When he had a nervous breakdown, he retreats to the time of his youth. But what do the people on the moon want? Why are they fighting this war for independence? Well, the main conflict between the moon and the Earth is the moon. The people on the moon, the settlers on the moon, want to move into the frontier, move out into into space. They think humanity's future is in the space. And the people on Earth instead embrace a philosophy, basically kind of one worldism or one happy Earth, and that we can be happy on Earth. We don't need to move into the future. And it seems a stupid thing to fight over, but it really gets to the heart of Dick's vision of the frontier. He's done this again and again in his stories, in like Invariable Man and Mr. Spaceship. It's in Solar Lottery. It's in To a Degree, The Man Who Japed. It's in a lot of his stories is this tension over the world Jones made too. It's a big one there. Is this tension between the kind of entropy. Is entropy the right word for this? I guess the paralysis almost, as James Joyce talks and uses this term in Dubliners, right? The problem with Dublin was paralysis, right? Everyone is stuck at home. They always retreat back. They can never break free, right? They're like Leopold Bloom, trying to escape, trying to get out, having plenty of good reasons to escape, and then ends up back in bed, right? At the end of the story. So you have this paralysis, but then there's always this need to break out to the frontier, and it's very optimistic in a lot of Dick's early fiction. And I know he does change his view about the frontier in Three Sigmata of Palmer Eldritch and other stories, but in much of his early career, he's got this idea that humanity has to break free of whatever's trapping them and whatever's keeping them there. And that's the choice Ragglegum has at the end. He can either retreat back to the 1950s, to his youth, do his job, do the newspaper contest, pretend he never escaped, or he has the option to break free and join with the lunatics. And that's the choice he makes. He makes the choice that the lunatics are right, the people on the moon are right. Humanity's future must be into space, and it must be in the stars. Now, I want to compare this to a few other stories that Dick wrote around this time period dealing with shifting realities and false fronts and false truths, and this question, is the world we live in a real world? And as I see it, there's really 4 stories, all written around the same time period, that deal with this theme. One was Cosmic Puppets, in which you have shifting realities, but that's due to the power of the gods. It's due to fate. It's due to things beyond human control or human power. Really, that's just so that town Millgate is completely shifted and changed because that's what these gods need for whatever the war they're involved in. Then you have Eye in the Sky, which is all about the internal psychology of the characters. It's about how each character has their own. Each person in the universe ultimately has their own way of looking at the world, their own subjectivities, right? They see a world as real, but they're seeing it filtered through their own ideology and their thoughts. So in that story, we get 4 distinct ideological frameworks that each are projected on other people and create a new world. And so the pessimistic reading of Eye in the Sky is that we really can't communicate, we really can't understand each other because we're always going to have this gap, that we're all looking at the world through a perverse and strange lens. And then we have in 1962 the publication of The Man in the High Castle, which it's hard to categorize. It's more of a meta-philosophical take on that concept of what is real. So it doesn't really... It kind of combines a bit of everything in that one. You have the political, you have the subjective, the individual, and you have the metaphysical all at work in there. Now what you have in Time Out of Joint, though, is a very political reading of this, where it's a political act to create this world for Raggle Gum. He's enslaved, essentially, for his labor. And so this idea of the suburbs being a place to enslave a working class is something that Dick, I think, is on his mind to some degree in this story. But it's political. It's about the necessity of war, and it's about what an authoritarian government will do and the ends it will go to protect his own interests, even to destroy human beings' understanding of reality, manipulate their psychology, and even go as far as creating a whole false reality. So it's the more political reading of the most political of these four books, looking at shifting realities in this time period. But I think it's really these four works really constitute the core of what Dick had to say about shifting realities at this part of his career. In the 1960s, he's going to go back to stories of political systems, like in The Game Players of Titan. He's going to play with religion a little bit, like in The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. He's going to go back to themes of work and Galactic Pot Healer, and he's going to have to deal with a lot of themes. The 1960s for Dick are a great epic period. He publishes like 15 novels in a 10-year period. I think another 20 or so stories, and they're all great in their own way. But by 1960, in 1962 at least, Dick had pretty much established a pretty interesting theory, a general theory about shifting realities through this series of novels that are connected on this theme of false fronts. Okay, now this book is also very thematically rich. I think it's brilliant because it unfolds as a mystery, and the mystery is not resolved till the final chapters. In Eye in the Sky, for instance, yeah, you have a mystery of what's going on, but it's revealed halfway in the story what it is, and then you have three other examples of the same thing, but there's nothing new we really learn. It's just him playing with the concept. Now, nevertheless, being kind of a slowly unfolding mystery, it's very thematically rich. The core theme, though, is the suburbs as paralysis and drawing people in and keeping people stuck in one way, right? Something you can't break free of. And very interchangeable, very closed off, though, very banal is what you get. And then you have, and everything's constructed, of course, in there. And I think that's Dick's ultimate view of the suburbs. But then you have the frontier, where it's a place human beings can be creative. And that is the pull at the end of the story. Another theme we have here is adultery and false families. There is a subplot here of adultery, although it's hard. In the end, we realize it's not really adultery. But basically, Bill and Junie Black are married in the construction, in the program. Yet Raggle Gum basically falls in love with Junie Black and tries to seduce her a couple times, and they actually begin to have a relationship. Now that plot has dropped off in the end of the story, but nevertheless, you have this. Raggle Gum is a bit of a homewrecker in the story, but we learn later on that actually it was the state that was the homewrecker, because Margot and Bill Black were the true married couple, but they have to become adulterous to maintain this facade and this false reality for the purposes of the government's need to keep Raggle Gum occupied and doing his job. But the whole idea that in the suburbs our families become interchangeable and just random is, I think, kind of disturbing and a bit powerful to think about it. Dick, I think, has this idea, and it comes true in a lot of his work, that not only are marriages flawed, but they're just kind of arbitrary and random, and that people just sort of end up together and no one really knows why. And I at one point, even Vic, I think it is, or is it Raggle Gum, asks, like, why does someone as beautiful as Junie Black end up with this doofus Bill Black? And when Raggle Gum falls in with Junie, Vic says to him, like, why someone like you wants to end up with Junie Black? And the sense we get is that these relationships are all just random chance. The fates are just picking names out of the hat. And by the end, we learned that actually it was the government establishing relationships based on a program. Like, who should be Raggle Gum's sister? Well, Margot fits the psychological profile of who we need, so we'll put her in that position, even if it means breaking up a real-life marriage and condoning adultery. Of course, another theme in this novel has to be just what is reality and how we experience it. And I think the philosophy behind it is that reality is what we experience. And this, I think, comes from Kant, this idea of categories, that our reality is always being filtered through the categories, and we all have our own formula for that. So, but that's what's real for us. And it's fascinating. When you first read the story, you kind of believe the world Raggle Gum lives in. It's completely believable. When you realize it's false, you come back and you read the book a second time and you realize all the holes in it. It was so faulty and it was so wrong. Like, they never asked the question, like, what state are they in? Or the whole thing with Uncle Tom's Cabin being recently published. These are things that are obvious red flags, but you buy into it when you first read it. Just like Raggle Gum and Vic and Margot buy into this false reality. So it's believable until someone tells you there's problems with it and it's false. And so it's very hard to break free of what you perceive of as being real. Anything else to talk about here? I think there's a lot here about the Cold War security culture as well, if you're, not so much. But I think Sammy, the son, is a very interesting character in terms of this, because he's the kid who wouldn't have remembered World War II. And of course, it's all false history here. But he's the character who grew up after World War II in the Cold War. The other characters have the memory of World War II. In fact, Raggle Gum is put in here as a World War II veteran, having been served in the Pacific. But Sammy very much is completely buying into and accepting the security culture of the 1950s with the Cold War. And he has a clubhouse, and he's got a whole security procedure to keep people out that aren't supposed to be there. He's got signs, commies and Nazis stay out, which is something the adults who remember a time before the Cold War a little bit better don't embrace as much. And this reminds me very much of the story Foster You're Dead, in which you have a young boy who's psychologically tormented by the fact that he grew up in a paranoid culture, and he becomes a paranoid person, and he's obsessed with the need for a bunker in his backyard. His dad doesn't think it's necessary. He thinks it's a wasteful consumer good to buy these bunkers. It's just a way for corporations to make money. But the child is torn up inside over his need to have this bunker because he feels totally insecure just walking around in his life. And he ends up like sleeping in the showroom of a store selling these bunkers. Yeah, so it's kind of a horrible experience for this young boy. But he's been growing up told that you're at risk and you're going to die. And if you grow up in that environment, it affects you. And Sammy is kind of that. So I think there's a very interesting subplot here about Cold War security culture. And then the fact of the matter is they are spied on. They are being watched. There are spies. There is a war going on. All these things that are dreamed of in the delusional mind of the Cold Warrior were actually real in the real world beyond the facade. So I think Dick was having a little bit of fun with that, and it's all really well put together. So again, I'm going to put the end of this review, but it's a really great book, Time Out of Joint. If you want to know more of my thoughts on this story, a little bit more detail, you can go to my podcast. I'll put the link into this video, and I'll be uploading about 5 episodes where I go chapter by chapter through Time Out of Joint. So anyways, if you don't want to do that, just go read this book. I think it's a great place to start if you're just getting into Philip K. Dick. Good one. So thanks for watching this video. I'll be back with other content on Philip Dick. I have other playlists on this channel where I'll be exploring a bit on Stephen King and his view of history, a little on H.P. Lovecraft. I'll be looking at some anarchist texts and doing some other book reviews. So I'll just be putting a bunch of content out there. So subscribe to my channel and you'll get that content. And I'd love to hear back from you on your feedback, on your thoughts of this work or other works by Philip Dick. So again, thanks for watching.